Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going very far back and before kings, before castles, before anyone had the bad idea of inventing indoor plumbing. We're heading to a time when bedtime routine meant scraping together some moss, huddling next to your cousin and trying not to freeze to death, so get comfortable, grab your blanket, and maybe lower the lights. Because tonight we're going to talk about how cavemen slept. Or to be a little more poetic about it, how our ancestors survived the long, dark winters when fire was a luxury and warmth was a miracle. And yes, this will be as slow and unexciting as it sounds. You're welcome. Let's begin somewhere in Europe, roughly 40,000 years ago. You'd be standing, or rather shivering, outside a limestone cave. The wind would be howling across a valley dotted with pine and spruce. Everything smells faintly of smoke, mud, and mammoth dung. The family who lives here, maybe 12 or so people, has been awake for a while. But awake is generous. They're groggy, stiff, and vaguely miserable, which, to be fair, is how most of us feel in winter anyway. They probably didn't have alarm clocks. Their alarm was the cold. The sun barely rose above the horizon, and morning started when the fire turned from embers to silence. So, someone, probably the least important adult, had to stumble out, half frozen, find kindling, and try to coax life back into the hearth. It was a terrible job, but it meant everyone else got to pretend to still be asleep, lying in a half-dream state, faces turned toward the faint red glow, waiting for warmth. Now, what did they sleep on? Well, not much. Archaeologists have found flattened patches of grass and layers of compacted reeds mixed with ash, the ancient version of a mattress. Sometimes, they used hides from reindeer or bison, which sounds luxurious until you realize they didn't have soap. It probably smelled like everything. Smoke, sweat, decay, and that faint sour note of living in a cave. Still, it worked. Hides provided insulation from the rock floor, and the smell likely didn't bother them. After all, if everyone smells like mammoth, does anyone really notice? Let's talk about the fire, the centerpiece of every prehistoric bedroom. Fire was warmth. Fire was protection. Fire was also the reason they didn't die of hypothermia. But it was tricky. Too big and you suffocate everyone with smoke. Too small, and your toes turn into ice cubes. Most cave families maintained what researchers call a sleeping ring. Imagine a small fire pit in the center, and people sleeping around it in a rough circle, heads pointed inward, feet outward. The idea was that the heat radiated evenly, and no one got roasted on one side while freezing on the other. Children and elderly members usually slept toward the middle, where it was warmer. Adults and hunters, the ones who could tolerate the cold, slept near the cave's mouth, guarding the entrance. It wasn't exactly cozy. The floor was uneven, the air was damp, and every few minutes someone coughed or turned over, rustling furs and waking everyone else up, but it worked, somehow. Now, if you're wondering what bedtime looked like, well, it didn't really exist. People didn't think in hours. They followed light, warmth, and hunger. Winter nights were absurdly long. Sometimes 16 hours of darkness. So they did what early humans did best. They napped. Anthropologists think prehistoric humans practiced something called segmented sleep. Basically, they'd fall asleep for a few hours after dusk, wake up in the middle of the night, sit around, maybe talk or stare into the fire, then go back to sleep until dawn. There was no strict bedtime. Just a natural rhythm of dozing, waking, and trying not to die of boredom. During that middle wake period, they'd sometimes repair tools, check the fire, or tell stories. The prehistoric version of scrolling through TikTok at 2 a.m. Let's float over to another cave, shall we? Somewhere in southern France, maybe the famous Chauvet Cave. You've probably seen the pictures. Walls covered in beautiful drawings of horses, lions, and rhinos. The cave paintings are mesmerizing, but the artists? They were cold, tired, and probably just wanted to lie down. The soot on the walls tells us something. They lit torches and burned animal fat lamps. That's not great ventilation, by the way, so sleeping inside a painted cave probably came with a nice side of carbon monoxide poisoning. But the art suggests something else too, that people didn't just sleep in caves. They dreamed in them. Some researchers think those flickering lights, shadows, and echoing drips created a hypnotic atmosphere. Combine that with low food intake, exhaustion, and flickering firelight, and you've got a recipe for trippy, half-awake dreams. It's possible the earliest human dreams, the kind that felt prophetic or spiritual, were born right there, in the in-between of sleep and waking while smoke curled around the ceilings. Let's pause and imagine one of those winter nights in full. Outside, the snow falls quietly, blanketing everything in silence. Inside the cave, the air is thick and still. The fire crackles. Every few minutes, it hisses as a drop of melting snow hits a log. A few embers drift upward, glowing briefly before fading into the dark. Someone snores, probably the oldest man, the one who insists he doesn't snore. A child stirs and mumbles something half-dreamed. A woman turns over, pulling her fur closer. The fire burns lower. The air cools again. Eventually, the only sound left is the slow rhythm of breathing. A dozen lives, sharing one fragile pool of warmth. And above them, painted on the walls, the ghosts of horses gallop forever by torchlight. Now, before we romanticize it too much, let's be honest. Cave sleep wasn't exactly peaceful. It was survival. There were fleas. Lots of them. And ticks. And other small friends that lived in fur bedding. There were also the occasional uninvited guests. Wolves, cave bears, or just other humans who wanted your spot. So you didn't really sleep deeply. You slept lightly, always half aware that something out there might want to eat you. It's one of the reasons humans today still startle awake at sudden noises. That ancient reflex of "was that a bear?" is alive and well in our modern 3 a.m. heart palpitations. Now let's talk about the position people slept in. Not a huge mystery. They curled up. The fetal position was popular for a reason. It conserved heat, shielded vital organs, and made it easier to tuck into a fur or under an animal hide. You can actually see hints of this in prehistoric burials. Skeletons found curled tightly, knees to chest, arms folded inward. Maybe they buried their dead the way they slept, in that quiet, closed shape. Some anthropologists even argue that early humans used group warmth, a behavior known as social thermoregulation, where multiple people huddled together for heat. Basically prehistoric spooning. It wasn't romantic. It was practical. If your choice was between personal space and freezing, you chose body heat. Every time. One interesting question that always comes up: did they dream like we do? Probably yes. The human brain hasn't changed that much. REM sleep existed long before Netflix. Their dreams were likely filled with the same things that filled their days: animals, danger, food, family. But without our modern distractions, their dream world probably felt more real. You live in darkness most of the time. You listen to wind and fire and whispers, and eventually your brain starts blending it all together. Some researchers think this is how myths began, that dreams during long winter sleeps turned into stories told around the fire. A hunter dreams of a great beast, and the next morning everyone believes it's a spirit. Dreams weren't private. They were shared narratives. So, in a weird way, every bedtime in the Stone Age was also a little storytelling session. Humanity's first podcasts, if you will, minus the ads. And here's the part I like best. Cavemen, for all their simplicity, probably slept better than we do. No blue light. No clocks, no work emails at midnight. Their sleep followed the rhythm of fire and dark. They went to bed when the world went quiet. They woke when it brightened again. They didn't worry about productivity or 8-hour sleep hygiene. They just survived. And in that survival, They might have been strangely peaceful, even if their beds were made of reeds and the neighbors were occasionally saber-toothed. So, as you lie there tonight cozy in your climate-controlled room, with your blanket that doesn't smell like wet bear, remember this. We've been doing this, the whole sleeping through winter thing, for a long time. And in the grand, sleepy timeline of humanity, you're just another warm body next to a flickering light, drifting off as the world outside turns cold and silent again. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. That means you've officially lasted through a solid 20,000 years of bedtime history. Tonight, we're going to float a little deeper into the Ice Age. Because while most people picture cavemen snoring inside picturesque caves, the truth is, most of them probably didn't have one. Caves were luxury real estate, sheltered, dry, protected from the wind, but they were rare. By the time you found a decent one, you probably had to fight a family of hyenas for it. And trust me, they did not leave politely. So, let's step away from the caves and into the real homes of prehistoric winter. Imagine a valley somewhere in Central Europe. It's the middle of winter, and everything is frozen solid. The ground is white, the rivers are stiff with ice, and somewhere in the distance a herd of woolly mammoths is trudging along, grumbling about how cold it is. At the edge of a forest, you'd see what looks like a strange dome made of bones, branches, and fur. It's a little lumpy, a little sad-looking, kind of like a beaver lodge that gave up halfway. But this, surprisingly, was home. Archaeologists call these mammoth bone huts, and yes, they were exactly what they sound like. Paleolithic families used enormous animal bones, ribs, skulls, jawbones, as a frame, then covered them with hides and mud. Inside, they'd make a small hearth, arrange sleeping spots along the walls, and hope the roof didn't collapse during a snowstorm. It wasn't exactly modern insulation, but it worked. Think of it as the Ice Age version of a log cabin, if the logs still had tusks. Now inside those huts, the sleeping setup got creative. Some excavations show circular sleeping pits lined with straw or moss, sometimes layered with ash to keep away insects. Yes, ash, which also happened to smell faintly like burnt mammoth fat. Very chic. Sometimes they added stones heated in the fire, tucked beneath hides to make the ground warm. It's kind of like those hot water bottles your grandmother used. Except instead of rubber, it's a half-charred rock from last night's mammoth roast. People probably slept close together, limbs tangled, the fire crackling nearby. If you woke up at 3 a.m. and rolled the wrong way, you'd either smack into your cousin or touch a half-burned bone. Either way, no one was getting a perfect 8 hours. Here's something you might not expect. Sleeping through the entire winter, like actual hibernation, might have been partially possible. Some anthropologists argue that early humans, especially Neanderthals, went into a kind of low-power mode during harsh winters. Not full bear-style hibernation, just extreme energy conservation. Evidence from fossilized bones shows interrupted growth lines, the same kind that appear in hibernating animals. That suggests long periods of semi-starvation or inactivity, basically months of lying still, conserving every bit of energy. So, yes, there's a decent chance your great-grandfather once spent an entire January just not moving. He wasn't lazy. He was biologically efficient. Of course, the idea of hibernating humans makes scientists squirm a little. It sounds absurd, like saying we all have a hidden bear mode that just needs a few cold nights to activate. But consider the conditions. Limited food, brutal cold, and very little daylight. You can't hunt much. You can't travel far. You just sit in your dark little hut, burning your last bits of firewood and trying not to eat the family dog. So, people likely entered a kind of torpor, sleeping for long stretches, waking only to eat, drink, and keep the fire alive. You might sleep 12, 14, even 16 hours a day. If you woke up, it wasn't to start your day, It was to stare blankly at the fire and wonder why you were born in a century with no blankets. Let's glide over to our other friends of the Ice Age, the Neanderthals. The eternal cousins. Stockier, stronger, and by all accounts just as sleep-deprived as we are. For a long time, scientists assumed Neanderthals were primitive brutes. But the more we dig up, the more it looks like they were actually cozier than early Homo sapiens. They made proper bedding, woven mats of grasses and herbs layered neatly over ash. Some of those herbs were even insect-repelling, like yarrow and camphor. So yes, they had what we'd now call natural pest control. They positioned their hearths carefully, sometimes even adding a little windbreak of stones, the prehistoric equivalent of good interior design. You can imagine one of them squatting down, grunting approvingly, thinking, yes, perfect airflow. Their shelters weren't random either. Excavations in Spain and Croatia show carefully arranged sleeping areas. One side for the fire, one side for rest, and even a possible spot for food storage. So while we call them cavemen, it's more accurate to picture them as early homebodies with a deep commitment to sleep hygiene. Let's zoom in on a single night in a Neanderthal winter. Shelter. The fire burns low, releasing a faint orange light. Outside, wind presses against the animal hide wall, making it rustle like dry leaves. Inside, you'd see two adults, maybe a child, curled close together under a shared fur. They breathe slowly. Every now and then, one of them stirs, adds a branch to the fire, and rolls back into the dark. You'd notice their faces. Heavy brows, broad noses, a little soot smudged on the skin. Their eyelashes flutter slightly. They dream of what? Probably not of mammoths or romance. Maybe just warmth. Maybe just the sun, and that's it. That's their night. Quiet, flickering, endless. Now, a fun side note. Humans, even back then, snored. The shape of the human throat and soft palate makes us uniquely bad at silent breathing. So yes, the gentle, rhythmic symphony of prehistoric snoring has been echoing through history since before written language. You can picture it. 12 people in one dark hut, all snoring in slightly different keys. A harmony of exhaustion. Someone rolls over, mutters something half asleep. Another coughs. The baby fusses, a dog growls at nothing. And somehow, everyone keeps sleeping anyway. That was humanity's lullaby. Let's talk about pets. Actually, because they mattered. Dogs owned, or at least early wolves who tolerated humans, were sometimes part of the sleeping circle. They gave warmth, protection, and, let's be honest, occasional fleas. But they were there. Sleeping with animals was common. Goats, sheep, even chickens in later eras, all served as organic heating systems. People slept with their food quite literally. In winter, if your shelter was small, every living body counted. The air was thick, stuffy, and smelled like a barn. But warmth was warmth. So when you imagine a peaceful Ice Age bedtime scene, picture it accurately. A smoky, dim little hut filled with fur, people, dogs, and questionable odors. Not exactly a spa retreat, but it worked for 100,000 years. Another cozy detail, winter lighting. Cavemen didn't just rely on fires. They made little lamps, carved stones filled with animal fat, with moss or twisted fiber as a wick. These burned low and steady, giving off a soft amber glow. You could hold one near your sleeping spot, adjust the wick, and let it flicker gently against the cave walls. It was dim, quiet light, just enough to see the faint outline of your hand or the sleeping form beside you. It's the kind of light that makes you instantly sleepy. The kind that makes shadows melt softly into each other, until you can't tell where one shape ends and another begins. You can imagine those prehistoric nights glowing faintly golden, with smoke curling slowly upward, fire crackling, and every mind drifting half in dreams, half in the dark. Of course, not all early humans lived in the snow. Some slept through winter in warmer climates, parts of Africa, the Levant, or coastal regions. Their version of winter sleep was less dramatic, but still communal. Open-air shelters made from branches, hides stretched across poles, fires burning in shallow pits. Nights there were cooler, not deadly. People would gather close anyway, because community was comfort. You'd hear quiet talking, slow laughter, maybe someone softly humming. They might fall asleep while staring up at the stars. The same stars you can see now, billions of years later. It's weirdly grounding, isn't it? Knowing that the sky above your apartment window is the same one that watched over the first human nap, but no matter where they were, frozen tundra or warm valley, the principle was the same. Winter was for stillness, it was the slow time. The world slept, and so did everything in it. Animals burrowed, rivers froze, the trees went silent. And humans followed along. They didn't fight the seasons. They didn't light up their caves to work all night. They just accepted it. In a strange way, they were better at resting than we are. They didn't have the luxury of insomnia. When the light disappeared, life simply paused. Now, one last image before we drift into the next part. Picture a cave at dawn. The fire has gone out. The air is cold, pale, and damp. Someone stirs, maybe a child, wrapping the hide tighter. Another coughs softly. A few embers glow faintly under the ash. You hear a single bird outside, thin, distant, but alive. Slowly, the group begins to move. Someone adds a twig to the coals. Someone else stretches stiffly, and the day begins again. It's quiet, slow, and a little sad. The timeless rhythm of life before clocks, before cities, before anything except cold and warmth, and yet it's the same rhythm we still carry inside us. That instinct to curl up when the world turns dark, to wait for light, to rest because the night says so. Hey guys, still with me? If so, you've officially survived the Pleistocene. Congratulations. Tonight, we're moving into the dawn of agriculture, the age when humans decided that chasing mammoths was overrated and that growing barley was the new hot thing. This was when people started to stay put, and when where do we sleep finally became a design question instead of a survival one. So settle in. We're heading into the world's first bedrooms, and trust me, they were about as glamorous as a mud hut can be. Let's start somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, about 12,000 years ago. The air is warm, the ground is brown and cracked, and small clusters of people are building something new. Villages. The houses are simple domes of mud brick, shaped like rounded beehives. No windows, one doorway, and a small fire pit in the center. They look cozy from the outside, until you step in and realize it smells like a combination of smoke, sweat, and damp straw. Inside, you'd find low raised platforms built of clay or packed earth. These were the first beds. Not because they were comfortable, but because sleeping on the floor meant you were basically volunteering to become a scorpion buffet. So people built up. They plastered a ledge of earth, maybe a foot high, then topped it with reeds or grass mats. It lifted you just enough to keep you out of drafts and away from crawling things. Congratulations. Humanity had just invented the first slightly disappointing mattress. Now, these early farming families didn't sleep alone. A typical Neolithic house might have 1 or 2 platforms and 6 to 10 people. Parents, children, grandparents, they all together, limbs tangled, breathing the same smoky air. Privacy wasn't a thing yet. The idea of personal space wouldn't arrive until, well, several thousand years later, and even then, mostly for kings. Night was communal. Everyone went to sleep when the fire burned low, and everyone woke when the sun lit the door again. In winter, when food was scarce and nights were long, people probably slept even more, curling together under woven mats, conserving energy like their cave-dwelling ancestors. You can picture it. The soft crackle of embers, The faint rustle of straw, someone shifting in half-sleep. The slow rhythm of collective breathing. It wasn't silent, but it was steady. And in that rhythmic sound, civilization dreamed itself into being. Let's talk about sleeping positions, because they tell us a lot about how people lived. In warm regions, people tended to sprawl, lying on their backs or sides, arms open, cooled by the night air. In colder climates, they curled, knees to chest, just like before. Families often formed heat clusters, children in the middle, adults on the edges, older relatives near the door where the draft was worst. It was both hierarchy and practicality. The door, by the way, was a flap of woven reeds, which means every time the wind blew, a small tornado of dust and ash entered the room. So if you were the unlucky person sleeping nearest, you probably woke up with half the desert in your mouth, but still it was progress. By this stage, humans had discovered something revolutionary: sleeping materials that didn't decompose immediately. Reed mats, woven rushes, and even animal hair textiles started to appear. They could be rolled up, carried, and reused. Essentially, the first portable beds. You could now sleep somewhere else: the roof, the courtyard, or near the animals, depending on temperature. Because yes, livestock often lived indoors too. Cows, goats, and sheep shared the same structure as people, separated by a half wall or none at all. Their body heat helped keep the house warm, and if you woke up at night and heard breathing, you just had to hope it was one of the goats. Now farming changed more than diet. It changed time itself. In hunter-gatherer life, darkness was an event. You slept when it came, woke when it passed. But in farming villages, night became scheduled. There were chores, grinding grain, weaving, feeding animals, that stretched the day longer. So people started using lamps again, this time fueled by olive oil or animal fat. These lamps gave off a steady yellow glow, soft but constant. Enough to work by. Enough to ruin any chance of early bedtime. The human race, it seems, started losing sleep right around the same time it started growing wheat. Coincidence? Probably not. Let's float to one of the earliest towns, Çatalhöyük, in what's now Turkey. 9,000 years ago, it was a thriving mud-brick metropolis, with hundreds of houses stacked together like clay Lego bricks. There were no streets. People entered through holes in the roofs and climbed down ladders into their rooms. Each house was basically one big room, with plastered walls and, again, raised sleeping platforms along the edges. Archaeologists have found impressions of woven mats and furs still visible in the hardened clay. When families slept, they did so together, surrounded by household goods, tools, pottery, food storage jars, even the occasional skeleton of a revered ancestor buried under the floor. Yes, you heard that right. They sometimes buried Grandma under the bed. It was practical. The house was sacred space and the dead were family. Still, not exactly relaxing to know your late relatives were literally part of the foundation. But that was early domestic life. Intimate, earthy, slightly unsettling. And how did they deal with cold nights? Fire, of course. But lighting a fire indoors without a chimney was a delicate art. Too big and everyone suffocated. Too small and frostbite came knocking. So people tended embers carefully, feeding them just enough fuel to glow but not roar. The air would fill with smoke, settling into a low haze near the ceiling. Everyone's eyes would sting. The walls would turn black. You went to bed smelling like a barbecue, but at least you weren't frozen. Over time, people discovered that ashes retained heat. So they banked the fire, covering it with ash before sleep to keep it smoldering. In the morning, they'd blow on it to rekindle the flames. That moment, kneeling, puffing gently at the coals, was the prehistoric equivalent of making coffee. A small ritual of rebirth that started every day. Now, here's something wonderfully dull. Pillow evolution. In these early periods, pillow meant thing you rest your head on that's slightly less hard than the floor. Bundles of grass, Folded hides or little clay blocks wrapped in fabric all made appearances. Egyptians later perfected the stone or wooden headrest, because nothing says comfort like resting your skull on furniture. But the idea was practical, not cozy. It kept bugs from crawling into your ears or mouth at night. Sweet dreams. So while your Neolithic farmer might have slept on a straw mattress beside a goat, at least his ears were bug-free. A small win. Let's drift for a moment into ritual sleep. As agriculture grew, so did religion. And in many early cultures, sleep was seen as a doorway, a nightly visit to the spirit world. People believed dreams carried messages from ancestors or gods. And since most ancestors were buried under the bed, you could say it was a very short commute. In Mesopotamia, priests even practiced incubation sleep, spending the night in temples hoping for divine dreams. They'd lie on special mats, anoint themselves with oils, and wait for visions. In Greece, centuries later, the tradition continued. People visited healing temples of Asclepius, slept in sacred chambers, and interpreted their dreams as medical advice. It was ancient psychotherapy, nap-based and vaguely unhygienic. So the line between sleep and spirituality blurred early. To sleep was to connect, with gods, with ancestors, or just with your own subconscious telling you to eat less grain. By the way, you might be wondering, how long did they sleep? Surprisingly, probably more than us. Without artificial light, people drifted to bed soon after dusk. In winter, that could mean 10 or even 12 hours of rest split into 2 sessions. First sleep, then a quiet, wakeful period in the middle, used for talking, eating, or other activities. Then second sleep until dawn. This segmented sleep pattern lasted well into the medieval period. So if you ever wake up at 2 a.m. for no reason, congratulations. Your inner caveman is just keeping tradition. Let's step back and notice something gentle here. As humans settled, sleep became less about survival and more about structure. You didn't need to stay alert for predators, just for the baby crying or the roof leaking. You weren't guarding a fire in a cave. You were tending a hearth in a home. Sleep was still shared, but it was safe now, predictable, maybe even a little boring, and in that boredom, civilization found stability. Every plowed field, every pottery shard, every ancient recipe of barley beer, all of it started with a well-rested farmer who managed not to freeze overnight. So yes, the humble bed, a lump of clay topped with straw, was quietly revolutionary. It allowed humans to wake up in the same place they went to sleep. A small, steady miracle. Before we drift out of this Neolithic dreamscape, imagine one last scene. It's late winter. The harvest is months away. A small village sleeps beneath a pale, star-filled sky. Inside one mud house, the fire glows softly, casting orange light on plastered walls. A woman turns in her sleep, her child nestled against her side. A man snores faintly, face half buried in the straw. A goat shifts in size nearby. Outside, the wind moves across the fields, the same wind that once howled through caves. But here, the people don't wake. They are safe. They are home. And the world, for a few quiet hours, is perfectly still. All right, so we've talked about where the cavemen might have slept, tucked up near walls, piled under furs, possibly spooning with a stranger who happened to be warmer than you. But now it's time to talk about how they actually stayed alive through the night, in the middle of an ice age, without modern insulation, heated blankets, or even the comfort of knowing that tomorrow's breakfast wouldn't be an icicle. Because if you've ever camped on frozen ground, you know sleep can become a slow, shivering death march, and cavemen had a few tricks up their fur-lined sleeves. Let's start with the most obvious. Fire. The eternal campfire. Problem fire was both friend and frenemy. Yes, it kept you warm. Yes, it scared away hyenas, cave lions, and things that went sniff-sniff outside your shelter at night. But it also filled your cave with smoke, the kind that clung to your fur clothes, your hair, and your lungs until you probably smelled like a burnt mammoth steak 24/7. Caves didn't exactly have great ventilation systems, so lighting a fire inside meant you needed to manage smoke carefully. And ancient people surprisingly did. Archaeologists have found clever signs of airflow design. Some caves had specific hollows or shallow pits dug near the entrance, possibly for controlling draft. Others had fire spots closer to cave mouths where smoke could waft out through natural cracks or holes in the rock ceiling. It's almost like early humans developed an instinctive understanding of HVAC. Just, with rocks and sticks instead of copper ducts. And then there was the ritual of keeping the fire going. Imagine a few tired hunter-gatherers half asleep, tasked with taking shifts to keep embers alive through the night. Letting the fire die out in January might mean waking up next to a frozen corpse. Or worse, being the frozen corpse. So they'd feed the fire in waves. They'd toss in thick logs, bones, dried dung, anything that burned long and slow. Yes, animal dung was an actual heating fuel. Dried out properly, it smoldered gently and gave off enough warmth to keep a small shelter bearable. Not glamorous, but effective, and of course it added a certain rustic aroma to your sleeping quarters. Fat lamps and greasy glows, but not every night was firelit. Sometimes the weather or the cave setup made a big bonfire too risky, especially in tight spaces. That's when the Ice Age version of a nightlight came into play. Fat lamps. Early humans discovered that animal fat, when burned in a stone dish with a bit of moss or plant fiber as a wick, gave off a soft, steady glow and a little heat, kind of like a cozy prehistoric candle. They'd carve shallow bowls out of stone or bone, pour in melted fat from reindeer or mammoth, and let it burn slowly. The flickering light probably cast weird shadows on the walls, perfect for cave art inspiration or just for keeping track of where your feet were in the dark. You can almost picture it. A group of early humans huddled around a dim fat lamp, the walls dancing with warm orange light, while one guy in the corner grumbles about the smell of burning marrow, fur, feathers, and the art of layering. Now, no matter how good your fire skills were, warmth really came down to insulation. And if you think medieval peasants invented the art of layering, nope. Cavemen were doing it first. Clothing from Ice Age Europe shows a surprising level of sophistication. People wore multiple layers of animal hide stitched together with sinew. Fur side in for softness, fur side out for warmth. They even made crude mittens and hats. Because, let's face it, no one wants frostbite ears. At night, all of that came off and turned into bedding. Picture an entire group spreading hides over the floor, then rolling themselves like burritos inside layers of fur. The air between the layers trapped body heat, just like modern sleeping bags. And they didn't just use fur from one kind of animal. There was a hierarchy. Reindeer fur was light and fluffy, good for layering. Bear fur? Thick and warm, but smelled very bare. Woolly mammoth hair was coarse, but you could weave it with softer animal skins for padding. Basically, prehistoric bedding was a DIY project in survival fashion. Group heat, the original sleep economy now. Let's talk about the social side of sleep, because warmth wasn't just about fire or furs. It was about each other. Humans, much like penguins, discovered that body heat shared is body heat doubled. So they slept in groups, tight groups. Imagine 6 or 7 people lined shoulder to shoulder, maybe with a few kids or elders in the center where it was warmest. This wasn't just cozy, it was strategy. A human body gives off about 100 watts of heat while resting. Multiply that by a few dozen people, add some fur insulation, and you've got a prehistoric heating system. There's even speculation that sleeping positions were communal, with some cultures naturally forming circular or spiral shapes to conserve both space and warmth. It's less family bed and more thermal cluster of survival. And of course, if you were on the edge of that cluster, you probably woke up cold and miserable. But hey, survival of the snuggliest. The floor is lava, and also ice. The ground was the real enemy. Sleeping on cold rock drains heat faster than you'd expect. So cavemen learned to build barriers. First came layers of grass, moss, or pine needles. Nature's first mattresses. Then came hides. Then more hides. In some well-preserved sites, archaeologists have even found depressions lined with reeds or straw, clearly sleeping nests made intentionally for warmth. Think of it as early memory foam, minus the comfort and plus a constant risk of bugs. And if they were in snow-covered regions, they sometimes hollowed out depressions in the snow and lined them with dry grass before laying down furs, similar to how modern Arctic nomads build snow shelters. The insulation from snow itself helped trap body heat. So yes, cavemen were literally sleeping inside snow, staying warm through physics and stubbornness. The night routine. What did bedtime look like? Probably slow, repetitive, and full of little rituals. One person might check the fire. Another might feed scraps to a dog or wolf curled up nearby. Children might already be asleep, bundled together near the back of the shelter. Outside, the wind howled through stone cracks, echoing faintly like distant animal calls. Inside, the low light flickered, highlighting the faint outlines of tools and weapons leaning against the wall. Someone yawns. Someone else rolls over and mutters something unintelligible in the dark. And then, silence. Except for the soft crackle of embers and the occasional snore. The entire little cluster of humanity drifts into half-sleep, half-survival mode. A state we might call rest, but which probably wasn't restful at all. They'd wake up often, adjust furs, check the fire, listen for predators. Sleep wasn't one big, continuous stretch. It came in pieces. Some anthropologists even believe humans evolved to sleep in shifts for this very reason, to keep watch over fire and safety through the night. So maybe the modern idea of broken sleep isn't modern at all. Maybe it's just our Ice Age brains remembering the night watch. Firelight companions. And speaking of watchful companions, this was also around the time when early humans began forming relationships with wolves. You can imagine how valuable a wolf or early dog might have been on a cold night. They were alarm systems, hunting partners, and yes, living heaters. A curled-up wolf at your feet could mean the difference between frostbite and comfort. It's likely that the earliest domesticated canines were winter, companions first, tolerated because they helped humans survive the cold. And over time, that companionship evolved into the loyalty and affection we now take for granted. So, the next time your dog hogs the blanket, remember, he's just following a 20,000-year-old survival instinct. The winter dream world with the warmth settled and the fire smoldering, dreams began. And that's something rarely discussed but fascinating. What did cavemen dream about? We'll never really know, but hints come from cave art. Images of animals, spirits, and half-human figures might not just be art. They could be dream records. The flickering light of a fat lamp could make painted figures appear to move. It's easy to imagine an early human watching shadows dance on the wall until they blurred into a dream. And when you think about it, it's poetic. They went to sleep beneath painted skies, wrapped in furs, surrounded by their tribe, guarded by firelight and dogs. It wasn't comfort by modern standards, but it was belonging. It was home. Let's drift forward a little now, past those first sparks of warmth, past the Ice Age chill. Let's wander toward something a bit organized. Because as humans got better at building shelters, sleep started to change too. Caves turned into huts, fires became hearths, furs turned into woven blankets. So let's gently peel ourselves away from the Ice Age for a moment. Step out of the flickering orange cave light, brush the mammoth fur off our shoulders, and blink slowly into a new kind of morning. Because somewhere, many thousands of years after those first fires, humans finally decided that maybe, just maybe, living like damp, smoke-scented sardines wasn't the peak of comfort. This is the quiet, creaky dawn of what we might call the human bed. Not the soft, squeaky, Instagram-worthy kind you're lying on now, but the very first moment when people started thinking, maybe I don't have to sleep on a rock. So tonight, let's wander through that shift. From cave floors to clay huts, from piles of grass to raised platforms. Let's see how sleep itself began to evolve slowly, almost reluctantly, into something that looked just a little bit civilized. Goodbye, caves. Hello, huts at some point. Caves just stopped cutting it. Maybe it was overcrowding. Maybe it was the smell. Maybe it was the fact that every other wild creature seemed to want to live there too. Whatever the reason, humans began building their own shelters and small, temporary huts made from wood, reeds, mud, and bone. Archaeologists have found early examples of this from about 15,000 years ago. Circular huts built from mammoth bones in Ukraine, or reed shelters in the Nile Valley. They weren't much to look at, but they were ours. A space that belonged entirely to humans, shaped by human hands. Inside, sleeping arrangements started to change too. No longer just communal piles in the back of a cave, but little nests built with intent. You might have one for your family, one for guests, and if you were lucky or lazy, one spot that was yours. That's a big leap in psychology. For the first time, people began sleeping in private. It wasn't just about warmth anymore, it was about boundaries, comfort, ownership. A hut meant safety. A bed, even a primitive one, meant belonging somewhere, grass, clay, and bugs, the early sleep experience. Now, before we romanticize it too much, let's remember that beds back then were still glorified patches of dirt with ambition. The first versions were often just shallow pits lined with grass or reeds. Sometimes they'd put animal skins on top for softness. Sometimes they'd just burn aromatic herbs underneath, not for luxury, but to keep the bugs out. Yes, bug control was one of the earliest forms of bed innovation. In one ancient site in South Africa, about 200,000 years old, archaeologists found traces of mattress-like layers made from sedges and rushes, with a sprinkle of crushed leaves from a plant called Cryptocarya woodii, which naturally repels insects. So basically, your great-great-great-great-grand caveman had organic, bug-repelling bedding long before it became a Pinterest trend. The scent probably helped them sleep. 2. A gentle herbal perfume mixing with the faint smoke of the fire, the musty smell of hides, and the earthy walls of their hut. It's strangely cozy in a prehistoric sort of way. The rise of the raised bed. Eventually, someone looked at the ground, looked at their muddy bedding, and thought, what if we didn't? And so came one of humanity's most underrated inventions, the raised bed. It started simple. Wooden frames built from branches lashed together with vines or sinew, topped with woven reeds or straw mats. They weren't tall like modern beds, just a few inches off the ground, but that made a world of difference. It kept the sleeper dry when rainwater seeped in. It made it harder for bugs and snakes to crawl into bed, and it trapped a pocket of air underneath, which helped with insulation. There's evidence of raised sleeping platforms in early Neolithic houses, especially in wetter climates where sleeping on the floor was, frankly, an invitation to trench foot. In some early farming communities, entire families might have slept on a long, continuous platform along one wall, kind of like a communal wooden bench of dreams. So, congratulations, humanity. We invented the bed. Sort of. Domestic life and the sleep divide as villages formed. Sleep started reflecting social structure. In a small hunter-gatherer band, everyone slept together for safety. But in early agricultural villages, people started dividing space, literally building walls that separated sleeping areas. This meant that sleep wasn't communal anymore. It was domestic, private. The household became the basic social unit. And with it came routines, bedtime rituals, maybe even preferred spots for each member of the family. We know this because in places like Çatalhöyük, one of the world's first cities in modern-day Turkey around 9,000 years ago, archaeologists found homes with built-in raised platforms made of mud brick. Each house had one or more of these platforms clearly used for sitting and sleeping. Some even had multiple, a clear sign that different people, maybe family members, had their spots. It's oddly touching, isn't it? People began claiming corners of a room as their personal place to rest. And that tiny act, lying down somewhere that's yours, marks the first whisper of individuality in human sleep. Sleep, fire, and nightlife even with huts. The night still wasn't quiet. Fires burned at the center of homes or just outside them. Dogs barked. Owls hooted. People snored. And the world was still a dangerous, unpredictable place. So sleep wasn't something that happened in one long stretch. Most anthropologists think early humans still slept in segments. 2 shorter periods of rest with a wakeful phase in between. During that middle time, what we now call the watch, people would tend fires, whisper, pray, or just sit awake and think. In that sense, insomnia wasn't a disorder. It was a lifestyle. And maybe that's what made those early homes feel alive. There was always someone awake. Always a faint orange glow. A heartbeat of warmth in the endless dark. The bedding economy as farming took hold. New materials began showing up in bedding. People learned to weave plant fibers into mats and sheets. They stuffed mattresses with straw or hay. And they began using textiles in a massive leap in comfort. Linen, one of the earliest fabrics, came from flax, which was grown in Egypt and the Near East. Wool, from domesticated sheep, came later, softer, warmer, and much better for winter. For the first time, you could actually decorate your bed. A blanket wasn't just a tool. It was an expression of care, of ownership, maybe even of beauty. And yes, the wealthy farmers had fancier bedding. Their mats were thicker, their hides softer, their straw replaced more often. Because even 8,000 years ago, comfort was already a class issue. Animals, warmth, and co-sleeping. Let's not forget the animal roommates. In early huts, humans didn't exactly have spare rooms, so animals often slept inside. Goats, sheep, chickens, sometimes even cows. It sounds chaotic, but it made sense. Animals generated heat. They were protection from predators. And if you were an early farmer, your animals were your wealth. You didn't just lock them outside at night. So bedtime might have meant a house full of life. Children whispering, dogs pacing, a goat occasionally making deeply unhelpful noises in the corner. Somewhere a fire smolders. Someone snores. Someone gets up to poke at the embers. This was sleep as survival and community. Messy, smelly, but deeply human. The meaning of the bed. It's funny to think how much of our identity is tied to where we sleep. In those early homes, the bed wasn't just for rest. It was where people were born, where they ate, where they nursed their children, and eventually, where they died. That little raised platform, made of mud, straw, or wood, was the center of life itself. Even the word bed comes from old roots meaning a place dug or made for something to grow. And in a way, that's what it always was. A small human space carved out of the wilderness, someone to stop, to dream, to gather strength. From night to night, imagine it. A Neolithic village under a wide, quiet sky. The fields are dark now. The tools stacked neatly by the door. Smoke curls from the chimneys of clay and thatch huts. Inside, the warmth glows dimly. Someone lays down on a straw mat, wraps themselves in a woolen blanket, and exhales. The dog at their feet shifts once, then stills. Outside, a cow snorts softly in the night. A child stirs, then falls back asleep. Somewhere, someone hums, a quiet, wordless tune. The rhythm of early civilization finding its rest. The world has changed since the cave days, but in that moment it's still the same story. The simple need to feel safe, to lie down, and to let the night hold you. The slow luxury of comfort, The story of the bed doesn't stop there, of course. It keeps evolving, getting higher, softer, fancier, and much more exclusive. In later millennia, kings and queens would turn the act of sleeping into a performance. Beds became symbols, carved, gilded, embroidered. Peasants still slept on straw, while nobles floated above it all on clouds of silk and feathers. But that's for later in the night. For now, in this quiet middle age of humanity, the bed is still humble, still creaking with straw, still scented faintly of earth and smoke. It's not a throne, not a luxury. It's just a patch of softness in a hard world, and maybe that's what makes it beautiful. Let's drift on from here, from these simple huts and straw beds, into the next sleepy chapter of human rest. Because if early farmers built the first homes, the next age, the Bronze and Iron Age, would build the first bedrooms. Walls would rise higher. Sleep would separate by status and gender, and comfort, that fragile new invention, would start to mean something else entirely. So close your eyes for a moment. Listen to the faint rustle of straw, the hush of ancient wind against clay walls, and let's turn the page slowly. Let's ease ourselves now into something a little warmer, a little grander. The huts of farmers fade away, and in their place, the glint of gold, the whisper of linen, and the low hum of a civilization that decided sleeping wasn't just a necessity. It was an art form, because by the time we reach ancient Egypt, sleep had officially gone upscale. The same instinct that once led cave dwellers to curl up in a corner for warmth now had architects, priests, and entire dynasties designing elaborate sleeping chambers. Beds became symbols. Rest became ritual. And if you were a pharaoh, your bed wasn't just for sleeping. It was where you touched the divine. So tonight, let's drift quietly into the world of royal sleep, where dreams were sacred, where gold gleamed in candlelight, and where the simple act of lying down was fit for gods. From straw to symbol by about 3000 BCE, the Nile was the heart of a civilization that thought deeply about everything: life, death, and all the cozy naps in between. Ordinary Egyptians still slept in simple ways: mats on the floor, maybe a reed mattress if they were lucky, a thin linen cover if they were richer. Homes were small, built from mud brick, cool in the day and chilly at night. But if you were wealthy, well, things got much more interesting. The bed, or nebu, became a mark of rank. It wasn't just furniture, it was status made solid. Every curve, every carving, every sheet of gold leaf said, this person doesn't have to sleep on dirt. And in a society that believed comfort was divine, that gods themselves rested in golden boats each night as they sailed through the underworld, sleep became a miniature version of that myth. Every night, a noble lay down like the sun god Ra, closing their eyes to journey into the dream world. And every morning they rose again, reborn, restored, radiant. It's poetic, really. And deeply on brand for ancient Egypt. The first true beds now, let's picture one. A real Egyptian bed wasn't flat. It was tilted. The head was higher than the foot, supported by elegantly curved legs shaped like lion's paws or bull's hooves. You'd lie diagonally across woven linen cords, stretched tightly across the frame, like an ancient hammock but less forgiving. Soft? Not really. Aesthetic? Absolutely. Then came the most curious part, the headrest. If you've ever seen one in a museum, you might have wondered, how did anyone find that comfortable? It's a small curved cradle of wood, stone, or even ivory, set atop a short pedestal. It lifted the head just enough for air to circulate underneath, practical in the Egyptian heat, even if your neck paid the price. Think of it as a very early orthopedic pillow designed by someone who'd never actually taken a nap. And yet, that simple headrest carried enormous spiritual weight. Sleeping with the gods to the Egyptians, sleep wasn't just a rest, and it was a rehearsal for death. When you closed your eyes, your soul, or Ba, left your body and wandered through the unseen world. Dreams were considered messages, sometimes warnings, sometimes divine instructions. So your bed wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a sacred threshold, a bridge between the seen and unseen, the living and the dead. That's why headrests weren't only used in life. They were buried with people in their tombs. Archaeologists have found beautifully carved headrests among burial goods, including those belonging to pharaohs. Some were made of alabaster, others gilded, sometimes decorated with protective spells or the image of the god Bez. The squat, friendly protector of sleep and childbirth. Imagine that, and even in the afterlife. The Egyptians wanted good posture and divine dreams. Pharaoh's sleep, the original luxury suite. If you were Pharaoh, though, things got truly extravagant. Your bed was raised on an elaborate platform, often surrounded by carved panels depicting divine symbols, ankhs, lotuses, wings, and suns. The sheets were of fine linen, so thin they were nearly transparent, yet woven tightly enough to shimmer. Pillows might be stuffed with goose down, and perfumes or oils would be applied to the linens before sleep. Priests sometimes blessed the royal bedchamber, invoking protection for the sleeping king because, after all, his dreams could shape the fate of the kingdom. There's a famous saying carved on one tomb wall that reads something like, "Sleep is the image of death, and waking the image of life." To a pharaoh, that wasn't metaphorical, as it was daily reality. Every night he descended into the underworld, and every dawn he rose as Ra reborn, and honestly, that's quite a bedtime routine to live up to. Dreams and divine messages. Egyptians didn't take dreams lightly. If a royal had a particularly vivid dream, priests were summoned. Whole temples, like the Temple of Serapis or later the Temple of Imhotep, were built as dream incubation sites. People would sleep there in hopes of receiving divine guidance through dreams. One surviving. Dream book, written on papyrus, lists interpretations. If a man sees himself in a mirror, it means he will have a new wife. If he sees himself drinking warm beer, it means suffering. If he sees himself under a tree, it means protection from harm. Simple stuff, but deeply believed. And that belief turned the act of sleeping into something sacred, a chance to commune with gods while your body rested in comfort and luxury. So the royal bed wasn't just a statement of wealth. It was a stage for divine communication, tombs of eternal sleep. If you really want to see how much Egyptians valued sleep, look at how they planned for it after death. Tombs were designed as eternal bedrooms. Sarcophagi were laid inside stone coffins shaped like beds. Headrests were included. Blankets, miniature pillows, even small carved servants were provided to ensure comfort in the afterlife. Some tomb paintings even depict the deceased lying on their bed, surrounded by food, perfume, and family, a scene not of finality but of peace. In the Egyptian imagination, death wasn't darkness. It was rest, and in a way that's a strangely comforting thought. Across the desert, sleep in other ancient courts, Egypt wasn't alone in turning sleep into ceremony. Let's take a slow stroll through a few neighboring civilizations, each with their own spin on royal dreams. In Mesopotamia, kings slept on heavy wooden frames adorned with bronze and lapis lazuli. Their palaces were designed with inner chambers for rest, windowless, cool, and guarded by magical inscriptions carved on clay tablets buried under the floor. The Assyrians, famously superstitious, placed protective figurines near beds, little winged creatures meant to fend off demons. Because nothing says sweet dreams like a tiny clay monster watching you sleep. In Persia, later, royal sleep became a matter of politics. Only the most trusted servants were allowed near the great king's chamber. The royal bed was surrounded by curtains embroidered with gold thread, and the air was perfumed with frankincense. Every night guards and eunuchs stood watch while the king lay beneath silken sheets, Sleep here was less divine and more strategic. You couldn't be assassinated if you controlled who got close enough to your bed. Even luxury had its limits, apparently. The gender of sleep. One interesting twist in this era. Sleep began to divide by gender. In many ancient households, men and women slept separately. Sometimes it was ritual purity, sometimes modesty, sometimes just patriarchy doing what it does best. In Egypt, elite women often had private chambers adjoining those of their husbands. In Mesopotamia, women might have separate quarters, sometimes shared with attendants or children. But for the lower classes, it was still a shared affair. Families sleeping together on the floor, the same as they always had. It's a reminder that luxury sleep was the privilege of very few, and that for most people, rest remained a communal, practical thing, not a divine performance. The morning ritual. When morning came, if you were royal, you didn't just wake up. You rose. Servants entered quietly, bringing basins of cool water, perfumed oils, and linen cloths. The air would fill with the scent of lotus and myrrh. Musicians might even play softly to accompany the dawn routine. It sounds absurdly decadent, but for a pharaoh it made sense. Each sunrise wasn't just another day, it was a resurrection. A personal confirmation that you'd made it through the underworld once more. And so, sleep and waking were both acts of cosmic importance. The bed was the microcosm of the universe, a little world where night and day, death and life, divinity and humanity all met. The slow spread of comfort from Egypt, the idea of the luxurious bed spread outward, slowly, through trade and imitation. Greek visitors to Egypt were fascinated by the opulence. They brought back the concept of elevated couches and linen sheets. Romans, of course, took it further, adding feathers, headboards, and so much decadence that sleep became a kind of social theater. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in this quiet golden era of the Nile, sleep had become something transcendent. The cave had become the hut. The hut had become the house, and the house had become a temple, a place where the human body lay down, and for a few precious hours pretended to be a god. The stillness of royal sleep. Let's imagine it just for a moment. The palace is quiet. The walls are whitewashed with gypsum, cool and smooth to the touch. Outside, the desert hums, wind against sand, a distant cry of nightbirds. Inside, a single oil lamp flickers beside the royal bed. The linen sheets breathe faintly in the air. A golden headrest gleams beneath the curve of the sleeping king's neck. In the soft light, his face is calm, his hands still, his breath even. Outside the chamber, guards stand silent, spears crossed. Somewhere far beyond, the Nile slides through darkness, carrying the reflection of 1,000 stars. And in that perfect stillness, for a few timeless hours, the mightiest man in the world simply sleeps. The journey from caves to kings is a strange one, from stone floors to golden frames, from communal warmth to divine solitude. Humanity has always searched for the same thing, a safe place to rest. But we're not done yet, because after Egypt came Greece and Rome, and with them, a whole new era of sleep. Beds big enough for feasts, pillows stuffed with politics, and entire cultures that turned rest into leisure. By now, our story has drifted from caves and huts to temples of gold and linen. And somewhere along that long, winding path, humanity realized something important. That sleep wasn't just survival anymore. It was choice. It was culture. It was art. So tonight we're gliding gently across the Mediterranean, past the sands of Egypt and into the marble courtyards of ancient Greece and Rome, where sleep evolved again, this time into something almost intellectual, something indulgent, something civilized. The Greeks turned it into philosophy. The Romans turned it into performance. And in both worlds, the bed became less a place of rest, and more a declaration of who you were. So settle in. Breathe slow and let's slip softly into the world of marble dreams. Greek nights, golden thoughts. The Greeks loved questions. Everything, from the stars above to the way one should eat olives, was fair game for discussion. And sleep naturally became another topic to analyze, admire, and overcomplicate. To the philosophers of Athens, sleep wasn't a mindless act. It was a mystery, a natural puzzle hiding the truth about the human soul. Homer in the Iliad called sleep twin brother to death, not as a warning, but as poetry. A recognition that every night we surrender ourselves and each morning we're born again. Later, Aristotle, in his treatise on sleep and sleeplessness, decided to explain it more scientifically. He described sleep as a resting of the soul's faculties, a necessary cooling of the body's inner fire, a reset for thought itself. In other words, a philosophical nap. But to most Greeks, beyond the scholars and scrolls, sleep was simpler. A rhythm of daily life. Hot afternoons meant naps. Long nights meant gatherings, then rest. And yet even the simplest Greek bed carried a quiet touch of grace. The Greek bed, modesty and marble Greek homes were built around the oikos. The household, a small orderly space with rooms arranged around a courtyard. And inside, tucked into the shadows, was the klein, the Greek bed. Unlike the golden thrones of pharaohs, the klein was modest but elegant. It had a wooden or bronze frame, slightly raised with a woven base of leather thongs or cord. A thin mattress filled with straw or wool lay on top, covered by linen sheets and sometimes a colorful woven blanket, dyed with natural pigments like ochre or indigo. In wealthier homes, the klein wasn't just for sleep. It was also used for symposia, those famous Greek drinking parties where men reclined on couches, sipping wine, debating poetry, and occasionally inventing democracy between gulps. Reclining became the mark of a free man, a philosopher's pose, half awake, half dreaming, balanced between pleasure and contemplation. And perhaps that's where it began. The idea that reclining, resting, thinking while horizontal wasn't laziness, it was culture. The gods of sleep. The Greeks loved to personify the forces of nature, and sleep was no exception. In their mythology, Hypnos was the gentle god of sleep, soft-winged, calm-faced, dwelling in a dark cave beside his twin brother, Thanatos, the god of death. Their mother was Nyx, night herself, a vast and shadowy goddess who rose from the depths of the world each dusk. According to legend, Hypnos lived near the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Poppies and night-blooming flowers grew around his home, and from their scent came dreams. When Hypnos spread his wings, the world slowed. Even Zeus himself was once lulled into slumber by his power. To the Greeks, then, sleep wasn't weakness. It was divinity, a sacred calm woven into the very fabric of existence, and so, lying down to rest meant placing yourself under Hypnos's care, a nightly surrender to something beautiful and beyond control. The birth of the siesta in Greece's warm climate afternoons could be brutal. Even the most disciplined philosophers found their eyelids heavy after a midday meal. And so the custom of the afternoon nap, the ancestor of the modern siesta, began. At first it was practical. You rested during the hottest hours, then stayed up later when the air cooled. But over time it became cultural, even stylish. To nap after lunch wasn't slothful. It was wise. It showed you had the freedom to rest when others worked. It suggested balance, a harmony between body and mind. The Greeks believed that moderation or sophrosin was the key to virtue, and a perfectly timed nap was moderation embodied. So yes, and even Aristotle probably dozed off after lunch. Philosophically, of course, from thought to theater, Rome arrives and then came the Romans. If Greece dreamed of marble temples and noble simplicity, Rome dreamed bigger, louder, richer, more self-indulgent. The Romans adored Greek culture, but they didn't just copy it. They domesticated it, turned it into daily spectacle. Whatever the Greeks treated as philosophy, the Romans turned into furniture, and the humble bed was no exception. The Roman bed, when sleeping, became spectacle. Romans had a word for their beds: lectus. And like everything else Roman, it came in many versions, and each with a very specific purpose. There was the lectus cubicularis, for sleeping, the lectus tricliniaris for dining, the lectus lucubratorius for reading or writing late at night, and even the lectus funebris, the deathbed, where the deceased would be laid out in state before burial. Roman home could have more beds than family members, each one part of a different ritual of living. But the most famous of all was the triclinium, the three-couch arrangement around a dining table, where guests reclined to eat, drink, gossip, and show off their wealth. It was part meal, part theater, part performance art. And reclining was everything. If you dined sitting upright like a peasant, you'd be laughed out of the room. True sophistication was lounging sideways, elbow on cushion, goblet in hand, half awake, half decadent. Reclining like a god to the Romans, reclining to dine, wasn't just comfort, it was symbolism. It meant you were free. Slaves and servants stood, citizens reclined. Women at first were excluded, expected to sit upright while men sprawled at ease. But over time, elite Roman women joined the tradition too, reclining beside their husbands or hosting salons of their own. The bed, in this sense, had broken free from the bedroom. It had invaded every corner of Roman life, a couch for eating, talking, thinking, even dying. It's easy to imagine a marble atrium flickering with lamplight, silk cushions spilling over a carved wooden frame, the air heavy with wine and honey and roasted figs, philosophers arguing between bites, poets composing verses mid-recline, and somewhere in the corner, someone quietly drifting off on a nap between ideas. Sleep had become not a pause, but part of the performance, the Roman bedroom still. At the end of the night, or perhaps the beginning of dawn, even the most theatrical Roman needed real sleep. Their private bedchambers, or cubicula, were often small and dim, decorated with painted walls, mosaics, or soft draperies. A lectus cubicularis stood at the center, sometimes with bronze fittings, ivory inlays, or animal-shaped legs. Mattresses were stuffed with straw for the poor, with wool, feathers, or even swan down for the wealthy. Blankets were woven from fine linen or imported wool. And in typical Roman fashion, even sleep could be scented, with oils of rose, myrrh, or lavender burned before bed. Some elite Romans even had bed slaves, attendants whose job was to prepare the linens, cool the air, or massage the master to sleep. Luxury had officially reached its drowsy apex. The nap is power, but perhaps the most fascinating Roman invention wasn't the bed itself. It was the idea of what resting symbolized. In Rome, taking naps wasn't laziness, and it was status. To sleep whenever you pleased meant you weren't a laborer. You weren't anxious or pressed by the day's demands. You were a person of means, a thinker, someone important enough to schedule rest between banquets and politics. The Roman poet Ovid even advised lovers to nap together in the heat of the day, to let love and leisure blend like the breeze. And the vine, and the Stoic philosopher Seneca, though he preached simplicity, was known to enjoy a long nap after lunch, calling it the philosopher's luxury. Sleep, by this point, had transcended the cave, the hut, the palace, the philosophy. It had become a mirror of power, a quiet, indulgent pause in a world that never truly rested. The dream of balance, of course. Not everyone was feasting and napping on marble couches. The vast majority of Romans, farmers, laborers, soldiers, still slept simply, much like their ancestors. They shared small rooms, often windowless, spreading mats or blankets on wooden boards or packed earth. In crowded cities like Rome itself, people in tenement apartments, insulae, slept wherever there was space, on roofs, in corners, under stairwells. Slept wherever there was space, on roofs, in corners, under stairwells. The gap between rich and poor was measured not just in gold or food, but in softness, anger, and how comfortably one could dream. Yet even the poorest Roman shared something profound with the emperor on his gilded bed, the daily rhythm of sleep, the shared surrender to night, the same gentle closing of eyes. Sleep, after all, was the one true equalizer. The poetry of rest, as Roman poets like Virgil and Horace wrote, night was a sacred time. The world grew quiet, the air cooled, and even the mighty Jupiter seemed to doze above the stars. Horace, ever the gentle observer, once wrote, "Happy is he who, far from business and wealth, sleeps sound beneath his humble roof." It's a thought that might have made even the pharaoh nod in agreement, because by the end of Rome's golden age, humanity had come full circle again, from simplicity to luxury, from worship to indulgence, from shared warmth to solitary comfort. But still, always the same rhythm. Close your eyes, drift away, wake renewed. The Roman dusk lets imagine one last scene before we drift off ourselves. A Roman villa at twilight, the marble floor cool beneath bare feet. Outside, cicadas hum in the olive groves. Inside, the last light of day filters through gauze curtains. A woman reclines on a lectus, reading a scroll by lamplight. The flame trembles. Somewhere in another room, servants whisper, tidying dishes from a feast, and the air smells faintly of jasmine and old wine. She sets the scroll aside. A slave gently unpins her hair. The house exhales into silence. She lies back, her mind hovering between thought and dream, between the day's clamor and the night's embrace. And then, softly, she joins the endless lineage of sleepers, from cave to hut to temple to villa, resting in the long, unbroken tradition of human sleep. In Greece, they thought about sleep. In Rome, they performed it. And in both, they turned it into something deeply, recognizably human, a balance of body and mind, of comfort and meaning, of waking life and the world beyond. So, we've stretched out in the caves, we've reclined on marble couches, and we've drifted through the perfumed dreams of Roman villas. Now, the sun sets on the ancient world. Civilizations crumble, libraries burn, empires fade into overgrown ruins, and the world slips quietly into darkness, not just metaphorically, but literally. Because in the medieval world, night returned to being something mysterious, something dangerous, something watched over by both angels and demons. And sleep, that simple act of closing your eyes, became once again a kind of leap of faith. So, tuck your candle close, pull your cloak a little tighter, and let's wander softly into the medieval night, the world after sunset. When the sun went down in medieval Europe, the world changed. Daytime was for labor, trade, prayer, and noise. But once twilight bled into true darkness, the village quieted like a held breath. No streetlights, no hum of electricity, just flickering torches, a few hearth fires, and the faint glow of the moon. The shadows thickened fast, and beyond the edges of the settlement, wolves, thieves, and worse waited unseen. The night wasn't just dark. It was alive, and people feared it. The medieval bedroom inside their homes, small wooden or wattle huts, families slept together in tight, smoky rooms. Beds were rare luxuries. The average peasant didn't have a bedroom at all. Just a corner with straw or rushes piled high, maybe a blanket made of coarse wool, and a small fire smoldering near the center of the room. Whole families and parents, children, sometimes animals, slept in the same space, sharing warmth through long, freezing winters. Above them, rafters hung low, blackened by years of smoke. The air smelled of earth, sweat, and burning tallow. The only sound was the occasional cough, and the restless shifting of bodies trying to get comfortable. We're far from marble now. But this was the reality of sleep for most of Europe's population. The upper classes, of course, had more. Their beds stood high, wooden frames piled with mattresses stuffed with feathers, covered in embroidered linens and velvet curtains to block drafts. Sometimes those curtains were so thick that they formed a little room within a room, a private cocoon of warmth and shadow. Even then, though, sleep wasn't private in the modern sense. Servants might bed down nearby. Children often shared the same chamber. Privacy as we know it didn't really exist. The night belonged to everyone and to everything. The mystery of the two sleeps, oh. Here's something fascinating. Medieval people didn't sleep like we do today. They had what historians call segmented sleep, or first sleep and second sleep. Instead of one long stretch of 8 hours, people typically went to bed not long after dusk. Say, around 8 or 9 p.m., they'd sleep for 4 or 5 hours. Then, sometime around midnight, they'd wake naturally and stay awake for an hour or two. They called this the watch, a quiet, liminal time between sleeps. During that hour, people might tend the fire, say prayers, check on livestock, or even visit neighbors. Yes, midnight visiting was entirely normal in the Middle Ages. Imagine trudging through the dark with a lantern just to have a quiet talk with someone down the lane. Others used the time more privately. Some prayed, believing those midnight moments were especially sacred, a time when heaven and earth brushed close together. Others simply thought, reflected, talked quietly in the dark. There are even references in diaries to couples using the time for intimacy. As one medieval text delicately put it, after their first sleep, they speak together and make children. Then eventually, sleep returned. The second sleep, lasting until dawn. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To think that waking up at 2 a.m. isn't a modern problem, but a forgotten rhythm of human life. Your body, perhaps, just remembers the old ways. The watchful hours between those two sleeps. The medieval world came alive in subtle ways. The watch was quiet but not empty. Monks in monasteries rose to chant the nocturnes, midnight prayers echoing softly in cold stone halls. Nuns did the same, their voices rising in the dark, carrying through cloisters and down candle-lit corridors. It was the hour of reflection, of whispered psalms, of murmured fears. The medieval mind saw night as sacred and dangerous at once, a testing ground for the soul. Demons were believed to wander then. So were restless spirits, but also angels, listening to prayers made by flickering candlelight. People often described the night as a mirror, when the true self, unmasked by day's demands, revealed its face. Sleep wasn't escape. It was conversation, between body and soul, between heaven and earth, dreams as divine messages, and in that conversation came dreams, not just idle nonsense, but messages from beyond. To the medieval Christian, the dream world was spiritual territory. Your soul, it was said, wandered while you slept, perhaps to glimpse truths the waking mind could not bear. There were rules, of course. Good dreams came from God, bad dreams came from the devil. And if your dreams were particularly odd or frightening, it was probably your conscience and her last night's spoiled meat. Monks, priests and scholars wrote entire treatises trying to decode dreams. The 12th century text Somniella Danielis, based on the biblical Daniel's dream interpretations, was basically a medieval dream dictionary. Dreaming of flying, a sign of hope. Dreaming of falling, spiritual peril. Dreaming of cats, well, opinions differed. In every case, though, dreams mattered. They were part of a divine dialogue. Sleep itself was a kind of nightly confession. The fear of the night for all its holiness, though, night was still terrifying. darkness wasn't just absence, it was presence. The medieval imagination filled it with things unseen, ghosts, witches, demons, all more active after sunset. Even natural noises took on eerie meanings: an owl's call, a death omen, a creaking beam, a spirit passing by, a sudden chill, the devil himself brushing your shoulder. To be awake alone at midnight was both spiritually charged and deeply unsettling. It's no wonder that prayers against nightmares, known as night terrors or incubi, became a staple of medieval bedtime rituals. People recited psalms before lying down, traced the sign of the cross on their chests, and placed blessed charms or relics near their pillows. Beds weren't just for comfort. They were small fortresses of faith. The wealthy and the watch now, in wealthier homes. The night looked different, but not by much. The great lords and ladies of medieval Europe slept in bedchambers that were half bedroom, half audience hall. Their beds were enormous, carved wood draped in silk and wool, raised high off the floor to avoid drafts. The curtains weren't just decorative. They kept warmth in and eyes out. Because even nobles rarely slept alone, servants often slept on benches nearby. Guards might be posted just outside the door. Privacy was still more aspiration than reality. The wealthy, too, followed the rhythm of two sleeps. Between their first and second slumber, they might pray, read, or talk softly by candlelight. For them, night was not only holy, it was social. A medieval noble's night could feel strangely crowded. Quiet, yes, but never truly still. The soul's journey in a way, the medieval concept of sleep, reflected the age's theology. Every night was a miniature death, a surrender to darkness, a letting go of worldly control. And every morning, waking was a kind of resurrection, proof of divine mercy, a chance to begin again. Many medieval prayers began or ended with this simple gratitude. Thank you, Lord, for letting me rise again. It sounds small. But when your world was fragile, when famine, plague, or war could take you at any time, waking each morning really did feel miraculous. Sleep was faith made daily. The night as a living thing, the longer you imagine it, the more the medieval night feels like a living creature. It breathed, in the rustle of straw, the crackle of embers, the sighs of those half awake in their watch. It had moods, peaceful one evening, eerie the next. Softly starlit or moonless and oppressive, it taught humility. You couldn't banish the dark. You could only endure it. You couldn't see everything. You could only trust. And out of that trust came a peculiar peace, a surrender not just to sleep but to something greater. The coming of dawn. Gradually the night gave way. The cock crowed. Fires were stirred. And across the countryside people rose for morning prayers, matins then lauds. Children stirred under rough blankets. Frost glittered on window slits. The air smelled faintly of smoke and cold bread. The first sleep faded from memory. The second, too. Dreams dissolved into the pale light of day. Life resumed its rhythm. Work, prayer, repetition. And yet, deep down, everyone knew they would return again to that dark, to that sacred quiet, to that other half of living that happened with eyes closed. A night to remember. If you could stand in a medieval village at midnight, you'd see almost nothing. A few candles glowing through shutters, a dog barking somewhere distant, a church bell tolling softly for the monastic hour. Above, a sky thick with stars, clearer than any we see now. Below, the faint breathing of a world at rest. And inside those huts, the pulse of life continued, and slow, steady, warm against the cold. 2 sleeps, 1 long night, and a faith that morning would always come. It's strange. In a time so harsh, sleep was one of the few gentlenesses people still had. Even with fear, even with hunger, they still trusted the dark enough to close their eyes. And in that trust, in those fragile hours between dusk and dawn, they kept the oldest human habit alive, the belief that to rest is to be remade. Next time, we'll drift quietly into the Renaissance, when beds became art again, when dreams were painted and studied, and when sleep once more became a luxury of the refined. So, for now, let's let the fire burn low, let the darkness settle softly over us, and let the echoes of the medieval night fade into calm, because for them, and maybe for us too, sleep was never just rest. It was a small act of faith in the light returning. Hey guys, welcome back to another long, slow drift through history's most yawn-worthy luxuries. Tonight we're gliding softly into the Renaissance, that shiny, art-filled era when people rediscovered the classics, invented perspective, and decided that even their beds should look like something Michelangelo might have taken a nap in. So go ahead. Dim the lights a little lower. Adjust your blanket just right. Let the hum of history lull you. Because tonight we're not walking through cold caves or smoky medieval halls anymore. We're stepping into rooms filled with velvet, candlelight, and the gentle rustle of embroidered curtains. We've reached the Renaissance, and where sleep became not just a necessity, but an art form. Let's start in Florence, because of course everything expensive and tastefully over the top in the 15th century somehow happened in Florence. This was a place where even your pillow could be a political statement. The wealthy families, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, competed not just in business or art patronage, but in how elaborately they could sleep. Beds became symbols of lineage, fortune, and the refined kind of taste that said, "We've moved past feudal straw mattresses, thank you very much." These weren't beds as we know them. They were architectural installations. Immovable objects of carved walnut, gilded posts, and heavy canopies embroidered with scenes from mythology, often with gold thread, because subtlety was overrated. If you were a Renaissance noble, your bed wasn't tucked away in a private bedroom, oh no. It was proudly displayed in your main chamber, right next to where you'd receive guests. You might even take important meetings sitting on it, because nothing said "I'm in charge" quite like lounging among embroidered cherubs while talking taxes. And of course, you didn't actually sleep on all that silk and gold. That would be impractical. You'd have linen sheets, often scented with lavender or rosewater, and maybe a few feather mattresses stacked so high you had to climb into bed like you were scaling a small hill. Beds had curtains now, heavy velvet ones that could block drafts, light, and the occasional prying servant. Drawing the curtains became an almost ritual act. It separated day from night, the public self from the private one. When those curtains were closed, the world disappeared into darkness and faint candle smoke. Let's drift north for a moment, to France, where the Renaissance bed reached its dramatic peak. French royal chambers were, well, let's just say they weren't shy. If you picture the bed of King Francis III or later Henry II, think more theater set than sleeping space. Beds were so large and ornate they often had names, like ships. The lit de parade, the ceremonial bed, was used to receive ambassadors, hear petitions, and occasionally, yes, for sleeping. Royal sleeping wasn't exactly private. Courtiers might stand around watching the king or queen retire, in what was literally called le coucher, the going-to-bed ceremony. People bowed as the monarch got under the covers, said a few scripted lines, and then quietly left the room. Because even sleep in the Renaissance had to be public relations. The fabrics were endless: damask, velvet, silk brocade, every inch embroidered with family crests or mythological symbols. Venus for love, Mars for strength, Mercury for wit. The mattress might be stuffed with goose down, the pillows with swan feathers. Beds were expensive, so expensive that they were often written into wills, passed down as treasured heirlooms. The phrase "to die in one's own bed" meant something. It meant continuity, legacy, the unbroken comfort of family wealth. Meanwhile, down at the less gilded end of society, Most people were still sleeping in far simpler fashion. In small Renaissance towns, beds were often built into the wall almost like alcoves. A wooden box lined with straw, maybe covered with rough linen if you were lucky. Families might still share a bed, especially during cold winters. Parents, children, sometimes even guests in these humbler rooms. The light came from a single candle, the smell from the hearth's dying embers. You might hang herbs above the bed to keep away bad dreams or sickness. The idea of luxury was simple: warmth, dryness, a space where the night couldn't quite reach you. And yet, even here you'd find little touches of aspiration. A colored blanket, a carved headboard, a painted scene of angels or saints to watch over your sleep. The Renaissance spirit of beauty trickled down even if the gold leaf did not. Now let's float gently to another place, Venice. Venetian bedrooms were some of the most atmospheric in Europe. Picture a narrow canal outside, moonlight shimmering on the water, and inside a room glowing in candlelight and reflection. Mirrors, a Venetian specialty, multiplied the soft light until it looked almost divine. The bed was the centerpiece. Lacquered wood, mother-of-pearl inlays, silken canopies that shimmered with movement. Sleeping here felt like floating in a gilded cocoon. Venice loved sensuality, in art, in music, and in rest. So the bed was not only a place of sleep, but also a stage for love, marriage, and intrigue. The famous courtesans of Venice would entertain patrons not in parlors, but on beds draped in fabric so fine they practically whispered. The act of reclining became part of social language. Graceful, composed, deliberate, to lounge elegantly was to show culture. Even the way one leaned on a pillow carried meaning. And of course, in all this beauty, symbolism ran deep. To sleep, to close one's eyes, was not just rest. It was a rehearsal for death, a surrender, a brush with the divine. Artists painted sleeping figures with halos of light or angels hovering nearby, suggesting that in dreams the soul might wander to heaven. Painters like Botticelli, Titian, and Raphael depicted sleep as a state of beauty, soft, luminous, and pure. The Virgin Mary was often shown resting peacefully, draped in folds of cloth that echoed the finest Renaissance bedding. Sleep was elevated, spiritualized, turned into an art of its own. Philosophers mused about sleep and dreams, connecting them to the balance of humors, the alignment of the stars, or divine inspiration. If you dreamed vividly, it meant your imagination was alive, perhaps even blessed. Doctors prescribed certain bed positions, certain fabrics, even bedtimes, depending on your temperament. A melancholic person, they said, should sleep on the right side to calm the black bile. A sanguine type might need cooler sheets. Because yes, Renaissance medicine took your bedtime very seriously. As the centuries turned, the bed, that once simple pile of straw in a smoky cave, had become an altar of self-expression. It was painted by artists, written about by poets, recorded in inventories and diaries. It witnessed births, deaths, prayers, seductions, and long, luxurious naps, and perhaps, in some quiet Florentine chamber, a tired merchant lay under his embroidered canopy, half listening to the sound of the city outside, the bells, the voices, the clatter of hooves, and drifted off, dreaming of the day's trade, his patron saint, or nothing at all. The Renaissance bed was a world within a world, warm, enclosed, beautiful, and deeply human. A reminder that even in an age obsessed with grandeur, all anyone really wanted was a soft place to rest. Let's stay there a while, among the flicker of candles, the velvet drapes, and the slow rhythm of sleep breathing under painted ceilings. And when you're ready, we'll move on to the Baroque world, where beds became even more ridiculous, sleep turned theatrical, and everything glittered a little too much. But that's for next time. For now, just close your eyes and drift in the glow of Renaissance velvet dreams. Hey guys, Welcome back to another long, slow glide through the softest corners of history. Tonight we're dimming the candles, smoothing the silk sheets, and drifting into the Baroque age, that grand, glittering, overly perfumed century when everything, including bedtime, became theater. So go ahead, settle in. Let your pillow find that perfect spot under your head. Because tonight we're entering a world where people didn't just go to bed. They performed it. Let's start, as these things often do, at Versailles. It's early morning, maybe around 8, though the sun's been up for hours, and the most powerful man in Europe is still lying in bed. Louis XIV, the Sun King, is propped up against embroidered pillows, wrapped in fine linen, surrounded by courtiers in full dress. A servant opens the curtains just enough to let a shaft of golden light fall across the king's face. Symbolically, of course, because even sunlight had to respect ceremony. This was called le lever du roi, the royal rising, and it was, quite literally, a show. Noblemen and high-ranking officials gathered in the king's bedroom every morning to witness him waking up. There were strict rules about who could hand him his shirt, who could tie his cravat, who could fetch his slippers. Each act of dressing was ranked by importance, an elaborate hierarchy of sleeves and stockings. The bedroom wasn't private. It was political. The act of waking, washing, and dressing became an extension of power, a ritualized reminder that the king's body was the center of France. And at night, there was le coucher du roi, the going-to-bed ceremony, just as formal, just as public. Imagine dozens of courtiers watching as the king, yawning delicately, took off his wig, murmured a prayer, and got into bed. There were bowing attendants, whispered etiquette, and yes, even a crowd to watch the royal candle being snuffed out. Then finally, silence. All of this around a bed, a massive, gilded, embroidered thing with a canopy so tall it nearly brushed the painted ceiling. Versailles' royal bed was surrounded by golden balustrades, not for protection, but to make sure no one got too close to sacred slumber. But Versailles wasn't alone in this. The Baroque age across Europe turned sleeping into spectacle. Royal beds weren't just furniture anymore. They were monuments, grand ceremonial altars to status and divine right. In Spain, the Habsburgs built bedrooms that looked like cathedrals. The bed often stood under a dome, flanked by angels draped in crimson and gold. The air smelled of incense and beeswax. In Austria, the imperial palace in Vienna featured rooms so ornate that one might wonder if anyone ever actually slept there. Massive portraits of ancestors stared down from above, because nothing says sweet dreams like the watchful eyes of your dead relatives. Even in England, the Stuart and Hanoverian kings had adopted their own versions of the ritualized bedchamber. Royal apartments were designed in layers, outer rooms for public business, inner chambers for semi-private audiences, and at the very heart, the bed. The royal bed wasn't just a place to rest. It was a symbol. It said, "Here lies authority, anointed by God, wrapped in silk." But of course, most people in the Baroque era weren't kings, so let's quietly step away from the echoing marble halls, down the narrow staircases, and into the more ordinary homes. For the wealthy merchant class, those climbing the social ladder, the Baroque period brought a new obsession with comfort and style. Beds were made with carved headboards, rich curtains, and feather mattresses. They weren't as enormous as royal beds, but they were still statements. Small declarations of refinement and stability. Bedrooms began to become private again, little sanctuaries away from the chaos of public life. This was the first time in centuries that sleeping alone, or at least apart from servants and children, became desirable. People started caring about sheets, scents, and fabrics. Inventories from the 17th century show that middle-class families owned multiple sets of bed linen, washed with lye and perfumed with lavender or rosemary. The wealthy even imported fine cotton from India, lighter and cooler than European linen. Suddenly, sheets weren't just practical. They were fashionable, and tucked between these layers of soft fabric, the Baroque sleeper dreamed of advancement, marriage, or maybe just a good harvest. Back at the top, the royal obsession with sleep kept growing stranger. Louis XIV, who we mentioned earlier, owned dozens of beds, one for each palace. But his true bed, the one that mattered, was at Versailles. He believed the state itself revolved around his sleep cycle. When he awoke, France awoke. When he retired, France dimmed its lights. It sounds dramatic, but that was the point. Baroque culture loved drama. Everything had to have layers. Music, motion, and symbolism. Even in Italy, noble families like the Barberini or the Farnese turned sleep into art. Their bedrooms glowed with frescoes of sleeping gods, painted ceilings of dawn breaking through clouds, allegories of night cradling the world. To lie down in one of these rooms was to join a mythic performance, half human, half divine. The religious side of Baroque sleep was just as grand. For centuries, Christian art had portrayed sleep as a kind of holy rest, a brief pause before resurrection. In the Baroque era, this took on an emotional intensity. Saints were painted in swoons of divine slumber. Angels hovered with half-closed eyes. The line between earthly rest and heavenly peace blurred completely. Church sermons even used rest as a metaphor for salvation. To sleep peacefully was to live in grace. To toss and turn was to bear guilt, of course. Most people's restless nights probably had more to do with cold sheets and bad food than divine punishment, but the metaphor stuck. Let's float over to England again, where sleep was becoming slightly less ceremonial and slightly more practical, though not by much. The Stuart kings, especially Charles II, maintained elaborate going-to-bed rituals, complete with footmen, lords, and whispered prayers. But among the gentry, sleep was taking on a gentler, more private tone. The four-poster bed with its canopy and heavy curtains became the standard of elegance. Beds were often placed diagonally in rooms, catching the best light or warmth. People decorated the walls behind them with tapestries, mirrors, or even portraits, because apparently you were never truly alone, even in your dreams. And yet, privacy was creeping in, slowly, quietly. By the end of the 17th century, even wealthy households began separating sleeping quarters from reception rooms. The bed was moving behind closed doors. The ceremony of sleep was still there, but it was softening, fading into something more intimate, and somewhere, between those grand velvet curtains and those quieter rooms, the nature of rest began to change. The Baroque world had turned sleep into a performance and an act of hierarchy, beauty, and devotion. But underneath the gilding and etiquette, something very human remained. The same desire for warmth, safety, and a few hours of peace from the world. A courtier at Versailles might spend the evening watching the king fall asleep. But when he returned to his own quarters, he too would climb into bed, pull the curtains closed, and drift into the same private silence. And for a few hours, until the morning rituals began again, all the pomp of the Baroque faded away into darkness and breath. So tonight, as you lie there, maybe not on a bed of gilded silk, but something more your style, you can imagine the flicker of candlelight across a carved canopy, the faint rustle of silk, and the soft, ceremonious sigh of a world that took even sleeping far too seriously. The Baroque age dreamed in gold, in music, in ritual. And yet under all that splendor it dreamed just like we do, quietly, imperfectly, and endlessly human. So go ahead, close your eyes. Let the grand halls of Versailles fade away, and drift into your own little kingdom of sleep. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're gliding gently out of the Baroque's golden glow, leaving behind the velvet curtains, the ceremonial yawns and the over-decorated royal bedrooms, and floating into the calmer, brighter, and slightly more rational world of the Enlightenment. So go ahead, loosen the blankets a bit. Take a slow breath, because this time, we're not in candle-lit palaces or echoing marble chambers. We're in a quieter century, one that believed the mind could be illuminated by reason, and maybe, just maybe, that the body could be soothed by better sleep. This is the story of how people learned to think and nap scientifically. The 18th century loved logic. It loved observation, diagrams, and neat explanations for everything, even dreams. For centuries, people thought sleep came from humor, spirits, or the favor of God. Now, Enlightenment thinkers were ready to replace divine mystery with anatomy and philosophy. They didn't quite know how sleep worked, but that didn't stop them from confidently explaining it. Doctors began describing sleep as a mechanical rest for the nervous system, a time when the fibers of the body relaxed after the day's tensions. The brain, they said, simply cooled off at night. Like a machine left to idle. It sounds simplistic now, but back then it was revolutionary. The idea that the soul didn't drift away during sleep, that dreams weren't direct messages from heaven, but rather the brain doing its own quiet thing, and this was oddly comforting. If sleep wasn't divine punishment or reward anymore, it could simply be part of being human. Let's wander to Paris, the heartbeat of the Enlightenment. By the mid-1700s, bedrooms were changing again. The grand public bedchambers of the Baroque had begun to feel excessive, even ridiculous. The enlightened elite preferred something more refined, intimate, and tidy. Rooms were smaller, better ventilated, and carefully arranged for comfort and health. You might find a small table for reading or writing letters, a clock, a mirror, and a bed with lighter fabrics, cotton or linen instead of heavy velvet. The bed itself began to look more like our modern version. 4 posters still existed, but curtains were thinner, meant for privacy, not ceremony. The canopies, once carved and gilded, now carried simple elegance. Soft colors, floral embroidery, nothing too loud after all. This was an age that prized moderation. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau both wrote about sleep, though in very different tones. Voltaire claimed he could sleep anywhere. On the floor, on a bench, even on the truth if it were soft enough. Rousseau, ever the romantic, argued that nature's rhythm should guide our rest. We should rise and sleep with the sun, not with the clock. So, the Enlightenment brought 2 kinds of sleepers, the practical and the philosophical. Those who wanted to understand sleep, and those who wanted to feel it more naturally. Let's drift over to London for a moment, where a new kind of middle-class sleep was taking shape. The English Enlightenment prized privacy and order, 2 words that would come to define the modern bedroom. By the late 1700s, homes were being built with dedicated bedrooms upstairs, away from the noise of daily life. The bed finally became something personal. Not a public prop, but a private refuge. And of course, this was also when people started obsessing over cleanliness. Washing the sheets, airing out mattresses, brushing away dust, all became part of domestic routine. The medical writers of the time even recommended sleeping with windows cracked open for the circulation of wholesome air. Which sounds nice. Until you remember 18th century London smelled mostly like horse manure and coal smoke. Still, the intention was there. Sleep was not just a status symbol anymore, but a matter of health. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment's fascination with time began to shape sleep itself. Mechanical clocks were everywhere. Bells rang through cities, marking the hours with precision. And gradually people began to structure their nights differently. That old medieval habit of 2 sleeps here, where you'd wake up in the middle of the night to pray, think, or chat, started to fade. The new world wanted efficiency, not wandering midnight reflections. Sleep became a single, solid block of time, 8 hours if possible, though no one quite agreed on the number. The night, once filled with mystery and superstition, was becoming just another segment in the clockwork of modern life. You could almost hear the tick-tock of rationality settling in. Let's float to Vienna for a moment. A city of candle-lit salons, string quartets and polite yawns. Here the Enlightenment and comfort danced hand in hand. Furniture makers were designing graceful new beds with curving frames and smooth veneers. They were elegant but simple, less about divine symbolism, more about human pleasure. Even emperors and empresses toned it down a little. Maria Theresa, the Habsburg matriarch, had a famously modest bedroom compared to her Baroque ancestors. She kept religious icons near her pillow. Yes, but her bed was smaller, her fabrics plain. Her son, Joseph II, the very image of an enlightened monarch, believed sleep should be orderly, unpretentious, and of appropriate duration, which is a very Joseph II thing to say. You can almost imagine him sitting up straight in bed, telling his valet that's enough dreaming for tonight. Of course, the Enlightenment also had its darker, sleep-deprived side. Writers, scientists, and inventors were famously terrible sleepers. Isaac Newton often worked through the night, forgetting to eat or rest. Benjamin Franklin invented his own sleep schedule, early to bed, early to rise, and then spent years lecturing others about it. Voltaire claimed he needed only 4 hours of sleep a night and filled the remaining 20 with writing, arguing, and caffeine. Caffeine, by the way, was changing everything. Coffee houses were the Enlightenment's living rooms, places where people traded ideas, read pamphlets, and stayed up far too late discussing reason and revolution. Coffee kept the brain awake, which was great for philosophy, but terrible for sleep. So the 18th century was the first time humans began consciously choosing to stay awake longer, chasing thought over rest. And maybe that's where our modern insomnia began. Still, not everyone wanted to live by logic. In more romantic corners of the Enlightenment, in salons, gardens, and country houses, sleep was reimagined not as mechanical rest, but as gentle reprieve from the demands of reason. Artists and poets began describing sleep in softer tones again. They wrote of peaceful minds drifting toward nature, of naps taken under trees, of moonlight gliding across white curtains. Napping itself became fashionable, especially among the elite. It was a sign that you were calm, refined, and confident enough to rest whenever you pleased. The enlightened nap was a luxury of balance, neither lazy nor indulgent, but civilized. A philosopher might take a brief nap between treatises on morality. A salon hostess might recline for 20 minutes before the evening's gathering. Sleep was no longer about ceremony or hierarchy. It was about rhythm and reason. And yet, as the century drew to a close, something subtle began to shift. People had measured, classified, and rationalized their nights, but they missed something. In all the neatness and order, sleep had become just another function. Efficient, tidy, predictable. So by the late 1700s, the Romantics were already stirring. Poets who would soon rebel against logic, who'd stay up all night writing about dreams, moonlight, and melancholy. They wanted the mystery back. But for now, in this moment, in the flicker of an enlightened candle, sleep belonged to balance. It was restful, moderate, a companion to reason, a pause between conversations, a quiet intermission in the grand debate of life. So as you drift tonight, imagine yourself in an 18th century room. Pale blue walls, a small writing desk by the window, and a light linen bed waiting for you. A single candle flickers. A clock ticks gently on the wall. You're neither royal nor poor, neither divine nor mechanical, just human. And after a long day of thinking and talking and being reasonable, it's time to close your eyes and let the world dim into calm. Because even in the age of reason, the most rational thing anyone could do was rest. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're leaving the reasoned calm of the Enlightenment behind. Those candlelit desks, tidy linen beds, and polite naps, and stepping into a softer, darker, and far more emotional century. The 19th century didn't just sleep, it dreamed. This was the age of the romantic imagination, when people began to see sleep not as simple rest, but as an escape, a secret portal between the ordinary world and the infinite. So go ahead, let the light dim a little more. The night is waiting, and it's time to wander into the world of romantic dreams. The Industrial Revolution was roaring outside. Steam, smoke, machinery, clocks. Cities no longer slept. But inside the hearts and poems of people, there was a quiet rebellion, a longing to dream again. The Romantics, poets like Coleridge, Wordsworth, Keats, and Shelley, turned sleep into a kind of poetry. They didn't want the clean logic of the Enlightenment. They wanted mystery, emotion, the delicate half-light between waking and dreaming. To them, sleep was beautiful uncertainty, the moment where the soul loosened its grip on reason and floated toward something larger, more spiritual and deeply human. Imagine, for a moment, a small cottage in the English Lake District. It's late evening. Rain whispers on the window. A candle flickers near a notebook half filled with words. Wordsworth sits by the hearth describing the moonlight on the water, the soft breathing of the earth at night. He writes of sleep as nature's soft nurse, a kind of maternal force, soothing the mind after the world's noise. Across the Channel in France, the painter Delacroix filled his journals with dreams, wild, colorful visions he swore were more vivid than waking life. And in Germany, philosophers like Novalis and Schopenhauer began speaking of sleep as a gateway to the soul, a bridge between the visible and the unseen. For the Romantics, the night was not something to be feared anymore. It was sacred dreams once dismissed as nonsense became meaningful again. But not as divine messages this time, as personal truths. Coleridge wrote of dreams that whispered poetry into his half-conscious mind. Keats claimed that sleep and death were twins, both peaceful, both sublime. And Mary Shelley, in one of the most famous dreams in literary history, awoke from a nightmare and wrote Frankenstein. In this century, the bed was not just for rest. It was a stage for imagination, for visions, hauntings, and inner journeys. The way people slept changed, too. The middle and upper classes now had dedicated bedrooms, quieter, darker, more private than ever before. Heavy drapes kept out the growing glare of gaslights. Feather mattresses and embroidered quilts turned sleep into something soft and luxurious. Bedrooms became sanctuaries, places for privacy, reflection, even secret sorrow. It was said that the true romantic slept by candlelight, not to see, but to dream more beautifully. And in portraits and poetry alike, sleepers were depicted as serene, almost holy, lying in pale moonlight, lost between this world and the next. The Romantics also rediscovered the night itself. They walked by starlight, wrote by moonlight, and sought inspiration in the hush of darkness. There's something wonderfully human about that. The idea that the night wasn't just a time for shutting down, but for feeling deeply. To sleep was to surrender. To dream was to discover. By the mid-1800s, this reverence for sleep spread beyond art. Doctors began to note the connection between dreams and mental health. Writers turned insomnia into poetry. The mind was no longer seen as a machine, but as a landscape, one that blossomed under the moon. And with that came the gentle acceptance that sleep could be both strange and sacred. That it wasn't something to conquer or analyze, but something to honor. So tonight, as we leave the Romantics behind, let's take a quiet moment to imagine their world. A candle's final flame trembling in a still room. A poet's hand resting on a half-finished page. Outside, a night bird calls, unsoft, distant, eternal. Somewhere, a dream begins to form, fragile, luminous, unexplainable. And in that small space between waking and sleep, humanity rediscovers its wonder. Outro. So, if you're listening to this in bed, maybe you can feel a little of that romantic spirit too. The world outside can wait. The noise, the light, the deadlines. For now, you are allowed to drift. To breathe. To let your mind wander without reason. Because sleep isn't just the absence of wakefulness. It's a kind of art. An ancient, invisible ceremony we still practice every night. Close your eyes. And think of all those who have slept before you. The medieval dreamers. The enlightened thinkers, the romantic poets. All lying under different skies, yet chasing the same quiet peace. Let your thoughts blur. Let the sound of the night soften around you. And when dreams come, as they always do, let them carry you gently away. Good night, and I'll see you in the next dream.